a while ago, I remember hearing about this story when I was young, and it was a test, or test isn't the word. I'm blanking on the actual word. An experiment maybe, that lasted about 25 years. And what happened is they got a group of these scientists got a group of children, and they one by one, individually, they put a child in an empty room with nothing except for a chair and a table, and on the table was a plate, and on the plate was a single large marshmallow. And the scientists would tell the child, okay, we're going to leave, but here's the thing. There's that big marshmallow on the plate. You can eat it if you want, but if you wait 5 minutes, we'll come back in and we'll put another marshmallow on the plate if you haven't eaten the first one. And if you do that again and again, we'll keep on adding another marshmallow every 5 minutes. But if you eat it now, you don't get another one later. That's only if you don't eat it. And so the scientists would step out of the room and they filmed the children and their reactions. It's the funniest thing because kids are weird, especially when they think they're alone. But some children ate it immediately. Some children waited. There was one instance of this. I think it was a modern take on this that I saw recently, where they would take a marshmallow and they would drench it. After 5 minutes, they would come in and drench it in chocolate syrup. And so the kids, they desperately want to eat it and they're picking at it, but they're like, wait, but I know that I can get more if I wait. Some kids just go for it. As soon as the scientists leave, they just stuff their face. 25 years later, so this is why the test or the experiment lasted this long. 25 years later, they went back to see where the children were in their present lives. And those children who decided to eat the marshmallow immediately were far less successful monetarily than those who chose to wait. It's an interesting experiment in trying to determine happiness. What is your priority? Present happiness that isn't going to last very long, or future happiness that you don't get yet? This is again the discussion of ethics. So some people would argue either way. There isn't a clear-cut answer. I think for me, at least for myself, it seems most clear that I would much rather be happy in the long run and endure endure things in the present moment that aren't going to give me immediate happiness. But others might be different. This is another school of philosophy called hedonism, which, again, it's totally valid. People live by this, especially celebrities. But Aristotle says, that there is a way to determine true, authentic happiness, where we don't have to argue about, we don't have to become relative and say, all right, well, everybody's happiness is their own thing. Because that can lead to a lot of danger, because what if your happiness requires the suffering of someone else? So Aristotle says that although there are different ways of reaching the telos of happiness, there is only one way to live it out, and that is a life based in virtue. This is going to be a really important word here. Virtue, virtue, virtue. So what happens when I ask somebody, what is the meaning of life? What's the purpose of being here? What should you be doing as you live day to day? And what if their response is, live life with no regrets, baby. Just do what you want to do. Be happy. Make yourself happy. That's all you can do. You only live once. Okay. All right. I guess you could live by that rule. If you believe you're happy, aren't you happy? Aristotle asks this. He gives a pretty good rebuttal here. He says, okay, I want you to take a look at maybe a parent and a child. Let's say 7 years old, and then the parent is, let's say, 35 years old. Who do you think is happier, the parent or the child? Clearly, it is going to be the child. And there's a lot of reasons as to why the child is going to be more happy. The child doesn't have as much responsibilities. The child has a very naive outlook on the world. They're not very well informed, and as a result, they don't really know how terrible the world actually is, and they're walking around with rose-colored glasses on, thinking that everything is great. And meanwhile, their parents are swimming in responsibilities and anxiety and depression, and having to manage maybe work plus a home plus a family plus taking care of the child and making sure that there's enough for dinner, that they have enough money for all of their necessities. There's a lot that goes into being an adult. And as a result, it's a much happier existence to be a child. But would you rather be a 7-year-old or a 35-year-old? Now, some people would say 7-year-olds, but that's because I chalk that up to just laziness and not wanting to have to deal with responsibilities. Because when you look at the life of a 35-year-old and all of those terrible things that they have to go through, on top all of those responsibilities, and then on top of all of that, they have to deal with understanding that the world is out to get them and that they have to battle against that to live a relatively good life. On top of all of that, or, I guess you could say despite all of that, a 35-year-old's life is far more fulfilling and far more rewarding. You have a child, you have a kid, you have a home, you have a family. And I promise you, if you were to ask anybody who has a child, who loves their child, you would ask them for their recommendation. Should I have a kid eventually? So many times you're going to hear, I promise you, it's tough, but I promise you, it's the best thing that could ever happen to you. That's awesome, but it's a big responsibility that cuts into your pursuit of happiness, at least momentary happiness. So 20 years from now, you guys have a choice. You can be out working, living your life, traveling around the world, getting married, having kids, or you could be living in your parents' basement playing video games all day because that's an easier way to live. That's an embarrassing way to live, and even though you may want that way of living, it's embarrassing to tell others that that's the way you're living. Why is it embarrassing? Because it's not very meritable. It's not because other people are going to judge you. It's because you know it's a life that's not worth living. It's you wasting your life. Aristotle's very clear about this. There are things that seem to give you happiness, that momentary happiness, but they are actually corrupting you. Now, his explanation of this is more than just wait for the marshmallow. Just wait for another marshmallow. Don't eat the one right now. His explanation is far better than I could ever have come up with on my own. But before we jump into that, I just want to say how grateful I am for Aristotelian ethics, because this was sort of the thing that united the Eastern and the Western worlds philosophically. And for about 1,000 years, so Aristotle was kind of lost to the Western world, and he wasn't really discovered again until Thomas Aquinas, almost 2,000 years after he was alive. For a while there, Aristotle sort of defined the world's philosophy. He was very popular among the Middle Eastern philosophers, the Muslim philosophers, and then he eventually became really popular among Western philosophers. And so for because of that, relativism had been able to be avoided for at least a few thousand years, and then came the Enlightenment and started to strip away everything that Aristotle taught, everything that Plato taught, everything that Christian philosophy taught. But again, we'll continue to tie these different schools of ethics together to give us a broad view. So let's jump into Aristotle's explanation of how we know about happiness, especially on an individual level.